Cool. Thanks, man. So there's been a lot of questions around user stories, and one of the best ways to do this stuff, learn this stuff, is by practicing. There's a lot to be said for user stories. People have written whole books about user stories. So what we're going to do, the kind of structure of the next hour and 50 minutes, is unfortunately you have to listen to me talk for a few minutes, but I did bring cookies. So that should help with listening to me talk a little bit. They are delicious, I can attest to that. Because what I want to do is I want to create a baseline for all of us for the exercise that we do about what we're trying to do with user stories. Because the purpose of the exercise is to get some practice, but also to reflect a little bit. So the exercise, hopefully you downloaded Scratch. There's actually going to be some work that you're going to deliver as part of the exercise. It's really easy and it's kind of fun. But it gets you in the mode of delivery. So it gets a feel for being Dan on a project or another developer or sysadmin or something like that. And it allows us to see the life cycle of a story, theoretically, in a really short amount of time. And so what I want to do for us today is set a baseline for user stories for that exercise first, and then we'll jump into the exercise. One of the other things is just real quickly, really normally always welcome questions, but if you have a question, just make a note of it and we can talk about it afterwards, just because I really want to get to the exercise. So we'll jump in. So obviously this is something that's really familiar to those of us who are writing user stories, the format. As a type of user, I want some goal so that some reason. So for our exercise today, I think as Eric mentioned, or at least hopefully you got the hint, we're going to be doing something with Pac-Man. So an example of a user story related to Pac-Man is, as a game player, I want Pac-Man to be able to swallow ghosts so that I can earn extra points and navigate the maze with fewer ghosts chasing me. So I get some utility out of this user story. Something that I think that is important to think about as you're writing user stories is that the subject of your user story gets some kind of enduring utility. So in other words, I would highly encourage, or highly discourage, highly encourage avoiding as a developer, as a user story, because a developer is going to walk away from a project. And so what you really want is the work artifact to ensure that it's going to have some enduring utility. Another system can be a user if you want to send data to another system, if you want to receive data from another system. A user is not necessarily a person, it's an actor, and an actor that gets some kind of enduring utility. This is actually really important. That format is important, specifically. The first person format gets us in the mindset of the subject, the actor. So we start thinking about it from the actor's point of view. Imagine writing that story, that first story is, as Pac-Man, I want to do something. That's a lot different than the person controlling Pac-Man. The point of view in the situation is very different. And we want to think about what we're trying to accomplish from the point of view of the person that's going to be using it. Having a standard format makes for a relatively easy to read backlog. Think about trying to find something where sometimes it's phrased in, the subject is phrased in sentences, sometimes it's phrased in phrases, sometimes it's written with something that's totally nonsensical. What actually ends up happening, and you can see this, there's examples of this online, didn't want to pull one out because it doesn't present very well, but where the column headers are the filler space. So as a I want and so that, and the cells are the actual stuff that you fill in the user story. And when you read it, you actually find yourself filling in the column headers and reading it as a sentence. So it just makes for really easy reading, consistent format, and a manageable backlog. And it keeps the end goal of the work artifact in mind so that I can do something. What am I trying to achieve? Because what we want to do is always work toward that value that we're driving from the story. And the most important thing is that it requires a conversation. Think about that story, that I had earlier. It doesn't say anything about how I'm going to be able to eat ghosts, for example, right? That might actually be another story. It doesn't say what happens to the ghosts after I eat them. That might be another story. And so what it does is it forces us to have a conversation about what should I do in this small chunk of work. And that is the most significant thing, because I don't know about you guys, but I interpret things that people say differently than what they mean all the time, or in some cases people interpret what I say differently than what I actually meant, which Sue can attest to firsthand. It's really important to not be in a position where you're reading something and choosing it to interpret something, that written artifact, in a different way than what the writer meant it as, because that then becomes a waste in your work, right? If you do something and the end user says, yeah, no, that's not what I meant, this is what I meant, stuff gets thrown away, you start over, we did something that didn't provide value. So by having a conversation, we're ensuring that we deliver to the output or the value that we need to get to. Really, really important. Sometimes it's hard to write it in that format. It really is. Sometimes it feels like it's useless. You probably can do it. I'm going to guess in 95% of the cases, you can find a way to get the story into that format, and it's just a really good discipline to create as you start writing user stories. So just get in the practice of it. Once you've done it for a while, you will find that there are times where it is waste. And you don't necessarily have to do it, but I would really encourage you to try and force yourself to do it, because it's a good disciplined practice. And for people who are new to the team, if you're working with somebody for the first time, in terms of a product owner or a customer or a consumer, it's easier for them. So when we have consistent practice, even if it's not useful to us, there's probably going to be utility to somebody else. So it's really good to try and force yourself to get into the discipline of writing user stories in that way. Even I struggle with that discipline. So user stories, there are certain things that we would call pillars of our practice. The user story is one pillar, and that format is a pillar. Another pillar is estimates, right? So estimates are an exercise in sizing. We want to know how big or small this thing is. Now the important thing is, and I know that this has been done a bunch of different ways, and I've seen it done a bunch of different ways, and we've talked about this a little bit, is that everything is a relative size. If I say to you, without these pictures, right, I'm thinking about a rowboat, and then I'm thinking about a sailboat, I guess you could put a sail on a rowboat and call it a sailboat, but we're probably going to collectively think that a sailboat is bigger than a rowboat. If we start talking about a cruise ship, I don't know anybody who's going to think that a rowboat is bigger than a cruise ship, right? And so it's the importance is the relative size of these stories. Now, of course, we can't measure things in terms of sizes of boats, and measuring and predictability is important. So that's why we do story points. And the value in the story point is that it's measurable, it's predictable, and it's repeatable. So we can compare things. I did this, it's like that, this is what the size of that thing was that I did. And so I can attach some amount of story points to it. We get velocity out of this, right? So this is the average amount of work that our team does over time. Velocity is going to go up and down. People are going to be out sick. Somebody's going to work on something that was harder than we anticipated. But velocity will generally normalize over time with the mature team. And what that does is it gives us a predictor of how much work we're going to get done. And it's an easy, repeatable process. Points are a relatively simple thing that people can get their mind around over time. A couple really important things to say about story points. They are not a measure of time. This is a hitch that people really get stuck on. So there was a study done as early as 1940 that basically said people suck at predicting their time. We have no idea how long stuff will take. And you can imagine, if you say something is going to take 8 hours, most of us are going to think you're going to get it done today. But lunch ran long because the server was slow. You drank too much coffee and you're making constant trips to the bathroom, or there's an emergency at home and your significant other, spouse, somebody important keeps calling and interrupting your day. A lot happens over the course of a day, and story points are not a measure of time. Now, if you're going to use time, and we did it with QMP, to get people to work with story points, do it in broad ranges. Because what you want to do is allow flexibility. the magnitude of difference between, so take for example, writing code, the magnitude of difference between what your best developer is going to do one story in compared to your worst, assuming they're doing the same story, is relatively high. It's not comparable. And so to try and tie it to time limits who can work on it, and that's not the point of a story, right? You want anybody to be able to pick up that story and work on it. Another really significant thing to think about is estimates will be wrong. We're not going to be right about estimating, and I found this quote that I really liked by Niels Bohr. Prediction is very difficult, especially about the future. Again, think about the interruptions that you run into in your day, the emergencies that come up. We think that something is like something else, but when we start actually working on it, it takes a lot longer. Imagine I think that I'm going to go out and cut the grass, and it's going to take me an hour because that's how long it takes me. And then I find out that my neighbor has been hitting golf balls in his backyard again, and a dozen or 24 of them are now in my yard again. It's going to actually take me 10 minutes longer because I got to go get a bucket, pick up those golf balls, and then dump them along with a nice happy note on his front porch. We think we know how long stuff will take, but we're really bad at predicting how long it'll actually take us to do something. And so story points are the size of an artifact of work relative to themselves is really what it is. So 1 point, we can, A is less than B is less than C. 1 point is less than 2 points is less than 3 points. The simpler the scale, the better. A lot of times, a lot of teams have a hard time. The bigger the scale, the more debate that you're going to have. The narrower the scale, the less room there is for debate. However, if you're finding that you get a really wide range of 3-point stories in terms of what you are able to deliver in an iteration and your velocity is varying wildly, it's worth thinking about expanding your scale to give you more flexibility around the higher end and in the lower end as well. So just some things to think about. A lot of this stuff the team can learn from as they're doing it and make improvements over time. So in order to get to the story points for a story, we estimate them. We want to do so blindly, and we want to reach a consensus quickly. And let me talk a little bit about what that means to do so blindly. So when I am getting a team of people to estimate a story, I do not want those people to know what someone else's estimate is until they know what their estimate is. So in other words, if the 3 of you are estimating a story, I want you to have your estimate in your mind, and I want you to all share your estimate at the same time. They might be wildly different, and that's actually okay, because there's something that you're thinking about that Dan's not thinking about. There's something that Dan is thinking about that Sue is not thinking about. And what we want to do is understand why we have the estimates that we have. What we don't want to do is spend a whole bunch of time debating and writing requirements and all that kind of stuff, right? Because if you think about it, estimating is actually a waste. It really is. Estimating does not provide end user value. It's a utility that gets us a means to an end and some measurability, predictability, and reliability, but it does not provide end user value. And so we want to reach a consensus on those things, but we want to do it relatively quickly. And quickly is not the same as hurrying, right? You don't want to hurry people along, but you don't want to create waste in your estimating process. Why is this so important? Because anchoring is really difficult to avoid. So anchoring is a science of cognitive bias, and what I want to do is just do something really quick to prove this point. So think about happiness. When you think about happiness, and don't do anything until I tell you to do something, think about people in California, and think about people in the Midwest. And what I want everybody to do is come up with a number in their head, 1 for California, 2 for the Midwest. If you think Californians are happier, I want you to put up a 1 when I say 3. If you think Midwesterners are happier, I want you to put up a 2 when I say 3. Everybody ready? 1, 2, 3. Okay. Not as many as Dan didn't participate. That's interesting. There's not as many 1s as I would have expected. So people who picked California, why California? Midwesterners. Why Midwesterners?
Lower stress.
Yeah, there's less hustle and bustle.
The experiment didn't exactly go as I intended.
For estimating what we would say.
Well, so studies show, maybe I shouldn't have told you about the exercise before I did it. That might have been part of the cognitive bias problem. Studies show that when asked that question, the largest majority of people that are not Californians say that Californians are happier. And they do that because of weather, sunshine, water, all the things that you think of when you think of a coast. The reality is, Californians deal with the same issues in life that we deal with. They have significant others, they have debt, they have kids, they have traffic, they have work. They have stuff that they deal with that is no different than what we deal with. And if you actually know coastal people, a lot of times they don't actually ever visit the coast. They leave that to the tourists. They just don't do it. But what do? We anchor on the things that we like to get away, right? I like to get into the sun. I like to go to the coast. I like to hang out and take it easy. And where am I going to do that? I'm going to do that in a place like California. So I'm automatically going to associate with my own bias that Californians they've just got to be happier than Midwesterners, which in fact studies show there's no difference in the general levels of happiness of the average person in those two places. The same thing happens when you allow someone to say story points before someone else, right? So if Dan is estimating with a group of other developers and Dan says 1 and I thought it was a 3, I don't want to look like a bad developer. So I might actually say 2, even if I'm thinking of something that's valuable to say about why I think it's harder than 1. And so what I don't want to do is give somebody that anchor point of, wow, maybe I'm wrong, what am I not thinking of? I don't want to look bad. So a really good practice for estimating is literally kind of like what we did for that quick survey. 1, 2, 3, and people put a set of fingers in the air. 1 finger, 2 fingers, and 3 fingers. Cards, there are playing cards for doing the same thing if your scale is bigger than 1, 2, 3. It's another reason why I really like the 1, 2, 3 point scale. It's because it's really simple to do and you don't need to take materials with you. But please think about this as you're estimating with your teams. Spend a little bit of time reading the Wikipedia article on anchoring. It's interesting to think about, and it's really important as we go through this work. And the ultimate goal in all of this, stories, estimating, and the work that we're doing to get to the point of actually being able to do our project work. And in this case, I used working software because that's my bias, but really we're talking about delivering, right? So the value is in delivering an output that an end user can consume and what the team learns by getting there. And don't lose focus on team learning, because the deeper into a project you go, the more information you have about the endpoint and the work it takes to get to an endpoint. So think about the first time that you ever started something. I remember the first time that I started hanging drywall. It's really easy when you can just put the entire board up on a wall. It's really difficult when you get into a really funky situation where the measurements aren't right, you've got a weird angle, you've got something that you've got to cut around, and I had some really awful looking drywall cuts. To this day, if I do drywall, I still have some really awful looking drywall cuts because I don't practice it. I don't do it a lot. And so practicing these things, they're not going to feel natural at first because it takes time and discipline. They're different than what we've done before. They're different than what our team is used to. People are going to be skeptical. They're not going to have a good feel for how this stuff works. And so it's not natural, but our role on these teams is to drive these practices, and these things work. There's a bunch of different articles that I can give you, and I'll post them on Confluence about people with years of experience either studying this or doing it hands-on about why these things work. And then the last thing is it's the importance of arriving at the need. And I love this picture. If you haven't seen it, it's maybe kind of hard to read and wow, super shaky. But ultimately the point is that when somebody explains something that's a picture in their head, that picture in their head ultimately doesn't end up always looking like what they really need. And as it goes through the line of different actors that might be involved with that activity, people are going to have different interpretations, and they're going to have different ways of executing on what was asked for. And ultimately, if we break this thing down into user stories that are sized properly, that people can understand and work with, that have a familiarity for doing things this way, we can actually iterate more quickly to that end user need.